All right, what's up, everybody? Welcome back. This is episode 2. We're going to be covering some cash flow planning. Kyle, I think this is kind of the perfect building block on almost what we're kind of building out here is like a 6-part episode on the 6 major platforms of financial planning. You know, we kind of hit on the investment planning piece last week, and that's kind of the big exciting piece that a lot of people are always trying to talk about. But you and I have talked, and we kind of feel like cash flow planning is like that base, that floor level, the number one piece that you want to really evaluate at the beginning, because if your monthly income and your monthly expenses are out of whack and you don't have extra monies to be putting away to savings, putting away to investments, you're just never going to reach your goals. It's just kind of like that logical over a long time horizon fact that, it's just going to make it really tough. So, if you could just kind of intro what your thoughts are and what you want to talk about today.
Yeah, I mean, cash flow, like you mentioned, is incredibly important, right? It's really the foundation of where we start with financial planning, because you got to get your house in order. And if you're making 50 grand and you're spending 60, well, ding, 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 we can recognize an immediate issue, right? We're not the American government. We can't just keep spending and hoping that our debt will, one day figure itself out. So, it's really something that it occurs during the entire relationship with a financial advisor, is managing your cash flow, because it's constantly changing, right? Your cash flow when you're working is certainly a lot different than when you're retired. And therefore, being able to analyze and understand your expenses at those times is equally as important, right? Yeah. So that's why, Thomas and I, we spoke about it, and cash flow planning was a natural next progression for us after investment planning, because again, it's really the foundation of where we start in financial planning.
Yeah. Cash flow is king, and I think kind of what you're laying out there, one of the more, the third, I would say kind of like where you're at right now, obviously understanding that cash flow is important. Where you're at when you're retired, super important, but kind of almost like planning for foreseen changes in the short to, to midterm, like where income might go. I think kind of like on the aspect of like family planning as well, because of like, you're a young investor, maybe you're mid 20s, maybe even early 30s, kind of depending on your life situation, kind of expecting where cash flow will go when you start having kids, when you buy your first house, maybe you buy a second house. How are those incomes and expenses, what's coming in, what's going out, how is that going to be affected? I feel like that's, super important conversation to almost kind of take the headwind on that.
It certainly is. And one thing, I've recently came to realize the importance of is being able to plan for the unexpected, complete change in cash flow, right? All of a sudden income you get disabled, do you have protections against that? You all of a sudden, do you have a plan in place for it? Do you know when my income in the door? How are you going to manage? How are you going to cope? And that's, part of the benefit of having a financial advisor help you create that plan, help you create that safety net for yourself, because it could be, as easy as setting up an emergency fund. No one really, it's very not thought of to have an emergency fund, especially at our age here, because it's hard to get money in the door to begin with, right? So, you think to yourself, oh, let me start saving retirement. Let me get my money into my brokerage account. But, it really starts with being able to survive the downfall of a loss of income, right? If you get unemployed or something like that, because you have to be able to weather the storm of not being able to bring money in. So even just that simple mindset of, hey, you should start putting this money into a savings account so that you can fund your living if money stops coming in the door. Yeah. Right. So that's just one avenue with which it can be incredibly important, is just opening your mind to a different possibility you don't think is going to happen.
Yeah. COVID, case in point, COVID, a lot of people lost their jobs. Yep. That was that unforeseen situation where income was gone because of a fluke situation. Right. Yep. And if you don't have that 3 to 6, kind of depending, I always, kind of my typical rule of thumb on emergency savings is, especially if you're like a 2-income household, something like 3, I would say anywhere from 3 to 4 months. If you're a 1-income salaried household, anywhere from 3 to 6. But if you're an entrepreneur, if you're a 1099 employee, that's really going to change. I've got households that I work with, business owners, that some of them have 8, some of them have 12. I actually, I'm onboarding a client right now. He's got 4 years of expenses saved up in a savings account, because he's starting to add new employees, went through COVID and, ran into a bit of a scare. So he's been, hyper focused and having money in savings. And, kind of on the flip side, you think about young investors where they're just starting to get that income, one of the hard parts about savings accounts is it's kind of right next to that checking account when you look on your mobile app, right? And so, if you start bringing in this money, if you're taking an income for the first time, maybe out of college, and, you're making 30, 40, 50, $60,000 a year, you're going to think, hey, I got all this money in my pocket, right? Let's live it up a little bit. And so it makes it kind of harder from a mentality standpoint to just stash money away and not touch it, because you're the young, super healthy person that you are. And, you just kind of feel like you're indispensable in a way,
Just like how we mentioned in our last episode about how you have to start investing with a plan, invest with a story, you have to save with a story. You have to be able to set yourself up, to save. You can't just all willy-nilly like, oh, you know what? This month I'll take $500 and I'll put it in my savings account. And I think I can afford $250 in this account. What we always recommend is very systematic approaches to it, in which case, you develop a monthly savings habit of a set dollar amount. And, maybe at the end of the year, you get that big bonus you've been waiting for, boom, you put a little extra in. But being able to develop the mentality and the habits of saving on a consistent monthly, quarterly, weekly, whatever it is basis, it really, really goes a long way. And that thus you can begin to see the value of the compounding effect on your money as well when you begin to put it in on a consistent basis.
Yeah. Yeah. And I know I've said this one to you, but one of my favorite Warren Buffett quotes, and I might butcher this, but he said one time, just kind of on investing habits, but I think it applies to a lot of different, habits in our life. But he said the chains of habit are often too light to be felt until they're too heavy to be broken, and I think that totally applies to investor habits, savings habits, things like that, because if you start to set them early, or if you're kind of making a life change and you want to adjust and you want to set them now, just being super diligent, super disciplined, and really consistent in that process, because, if you don't set those habits and those mindsets quickly and you're consistent about them, and you've got some passion to that piece there, it's going to make it a lot harder down the line when life hits you and you've got kids and you've got a family and you've got all these expenses, and just kind of that mindset makes it a lot tougher.
It certainly does. And it goes on, both sides of the coin, is that, you really feel good about yourself when you see the results of your habits starting to pick up. You see that your accounts are compound growing. On the opposite end, when you're paying down debts, it becomes addictive, with watching that balance go down, because that you're paying, if you've got interest bearing debts like credit cards or anything really, and you are being charged monthly interest, that eats away at you. And being able to, have a systematic plan to pull that down and watch that go down, and know that your net worth and your financial well-being is just continuously getting better. I mean, that's a really addictive feeling in and of itself. So I love the quote. I don't think you butchered it. I think that was exactly how it goes.
Doing my best. So just kind of let's pull back a little bit. So cash flow, right? What is cash flow? And, I think, I've kind of talked about this. Cash flow for us is what's coming in and what's coming out, right? So what income is coming in, what expenses are going out, and we can kind of break expenses down to, the technical term is discretionary versus non-discretionary expenses, right? Non-discretionary is going to be your fixed, got to be paid, monthly expenses, right? Mortgage, insurance, car payments, things like that, loans, but discretionary is going to be like going out to the bars, getting, food outside of groceries, right? Going to the movies, whatever it may be. For me, it's golf. I almost consider golf a non-discretionary expense, but I gotta stay true to myself. But just kind of understanding that this is cash flow, what's coming in, what's coming out, but also kind of segregating that out to different time periods in your life, right? So what is your current cash flow? This is kind of like the upcoming year, on a month-to-month basis, what's coming in, what's coming out. And then a midterm, what's 10 to 15 years, what does your income look like? What do your expenses look like? Are you having more kids? Are you thinking about maybe getting a new car in 10 to 15 years? How can we save for that? And then the long term is going to be the retirement play. What do you want your cash flow to look like? Where is your income coming from? If you're retired and no longer have a stable job, what are your expenses coming out? Are you wanting to have the Florida condo in the summer, or Arizona? Are you wanting to travel? Just kind of getting those things nailed down now so you can start to plan to get there, I think, is the important part.
These are the phases of everyone's life, right? That's exactly right. Everyone's cash flow situation, the income and expenses, it changes as you go through the phases, right? We're at a position right now in which we're in the accumulation phase, trying to increase our income. Lord knows we're taking on debts, whether or not you buy a car, you buy a house, this is the point in your life where, up until your 40s, potentially 50s, in which you're accumulating, right? And then all of a sudden you reach this point in which all of a sudden it starts going down. Maybe you retire, all your debts are paid off, but that money's no longer coming in, it's going out, right? So it's incredibly important to understand the different phases of your life and how cash flow will differ, because Thomas, like you mentioned, your cash flow in retirement, the planning begins today. Your income in retirement, you make that up throughout the course of your life. That's what you save for. That's what you put money away for. And being able to have a plan and have an idea of what that's going to look like today, what it could look like in the future. No one has a crystal ball, but it's good to start planning. It's good to be prepared for it.
Yeah. 100%. Because at least to some degree, you're making progress, right? Yeah. And I'm going to hit you with quote number 2 here that I really like, is kind of on the retirement planning side, whether it's cash flow, investments, whatever, is we've found that people often give into what they want most now for what they want most later. They give into what they want now for what they want most later. And that's the time where you're a little bit more vulnerable, right? Because that income isn't there from a job perspective to kind of support that. So just kind of reinvigorating the importance of that is key. Let's talk about efficiency. Let's talk about prioritization. So on the income side, the income, we're talking about prioritization of where savings and investments goes. Kind of let me know your thoughts on that.
Yeah, everyone's different. Everyone's situation, depending on the phase of their life with which they're in, is different. But, speaking of the perspective of someone in their 20s, they're in your 20s, 30s, 40s, what you really want to do is, as I mentioned earlier in the episode, is really begin to start saving, right? You need an emergency fund for a rainy day, because anything can happen. You could be working, whether or not you lose your job, your washer dryer could go. All of a sudden you have a $10,000 expense. That's an emergency fund cost, right? So that's always the first place I like to start. Make sure you got something that you can put your head on a pillow and sleep at night, right? Without being worried. Second place that I usually recommend going with money that you're trying to save and where it goes beyond your non-discretionary and discretionary expenses are going to your 401k, getting your match, right? Because that just seems, if you have an employer who offers you a 401k, 403b, any sort of employer funded retirement savings plan, and they offer a match, get that match, right? If they match 3%, put in 3% at least, because all of a sudden you're getting 6%, right? That's 100% rate of return.
Yep.
So I always, that's another easy place to start for me to recommend. Beyond that, I like to go to the Roth IRA. That's, not black and white answer, but an IRA, a Roth IRA, if you have the ability to go there, because, especially again, if you're in 20s, 30s, 40s, you got a long time for that account to grow. On a tax-free side, I love the idea of putting it there. Not only that, with a Roth IRA, and I'm sure we'll get more into the intricacies of a Roth IRA, but I don't recommend this, but some people call a Roth IRA your emergency fund, because you can go back in and take out what you contributed without any taxes or penalty, because you already paid the taxes on that.
As long as you held it for 5 years, right?
Yes. Yes. Good little point there. Yes, exactly. So, it could be seen that way. I like to think of it as not a place you go to if you need money, but after you get an emergency fund, you go to your 401k up to the match, you get a Roth IRA, and then from there, depending on where you are in your life, you can go to a brokerage individual account. You can go back to your 401k and overfund it. I have clients who are in their 50s. They haven't been saving as aggressively as they would have liked. They don't have the retirement funds built up that they'd like. So they are pushing as much money as they can into that 401k. Whereas, I've got clients who are in their 20s, 30s, who know that they've got a house on the horizon 5-10 years out, whether they're saving for some big expense in a few years, put it in the brokerage, because, you can't get it back out of your 401k unless you take a loan or something like that. So that's usually the order that I think of as a general rule of thumb. But, again, everyone's different. It's important to understand your financial circumstances and your situation to know what's best for you.
Yeah, I think that's great, and kind of like circling out, the high income earners. One of the conversations I really like to talk about with, high income earners, especially if they're young, most high income earners are going to have high expenses in retirement because they're used to a lifestyle similar to that. So, a lot of the pieces there is when I start to look at high income earners, normally those earners aren't able to contribute to normal Roths because there's income limits to that. So what I really like saying is, hey, if you're a high income person or you're a high income household, really try and focus on maximizing your Roth 401k if that's allowed, because there's no income limits to it. The contribution limit is 3 times higher, actually over 3 times higher now. You can do up to $20,500 in a Roth 401k now. I mean, the max on a Roth IRA is 6,000. Unless you're over 50, then it's 7,000. But you're talking about over 3 times that in the Roth 401k. So maximizing that, retire, roll it into your own Roth, and you got your tax-free income. And then on the brokerage side, there's a lot of help to that. And here's on the cash flow planning side. If you're trying to retire under the age of 60, you have to have a brokerage account. You've got to, because if you have all of your other monies and retirement accounts, and let's say you retire at 52, you can't touch your IRA monies unless you're doing a loan, or there's a very specific 401k piece that is a little bit helpful. We won't get into it now, but in a general rule of thumb, if you retire at 52 and all of your assets are in retirement, you have 8 years where if you're taking money out, you've got a 10% penalty and ordinary income tax if it's a traditional 401k, right? So that's a huge hit.
Yes,
and so the brokerage account is where you pull from that. So I think from a cash flow planning perspective, that's going to be the important piece.
That you guys got right into the conversation of what I think is one of the most important aspects of financial planning. That's building flexibility for people in the future. And that's why in that prioritization that I gave, it hits every piece there. It's, you got to have the emergency fund. You got to fund the brokerage account because it's taxed different than the Roth, which is taxed different than your traditional IRA or 401k. It's really important to be diversified in the way with which you save and the way with which your assets are taxed.
I've been kind of almost having like a 3-legged approach. It's kind of like, like that 3-legged bar stool, right? If you had a 2-legged bar stool, you wouldn't survive really well. If you had a 1-legged bar stool, good luck. If you have at least those 3 legs, you've got some support in the traditional, the Roth, and the brokerage side of where your money is going, right? Now, what if you had 4 legs, right? Technically even more stable, is where's that 4th income source coming from, right? And, that's where kind of the real estate conversation comes into play. I've got a few clients that are actually doing really well on Turo, which is essentially a car rental service. That's really kind of gotten on the map. They're essentially renting out their car for a per day price. I think just kind of finding those interesting ways, Uber Eats, DoorDash, just kind of, if you can make that $100 to $200 in monthly side income, that pays a lot of dividends if you're consistent and you actually save that money instead of spend it. I
like going out and golfing an extra few times.
Right here. That's me. And if you're just listening, I was pointing to myself there. Let's shift focus here. One of the big things on the cash flow side, and this could maybe even be its own episode, but talking about prioritization of paying down debts, right?
Yes.
And I know we've talked a little bit about this offline, but tell me your thoughts on debt prioritization, because I feel like there's kind of and I know you'll get to this, but there's kind of like a retail sense of how to pay down debts. But, from our CFP education, our experience, what's kind of one of the more effective ways on paying that down?
I find this piece to be so fascinating because everyone's so different, and the psychology of paying off debts really comes into play here, because I had to think about this myself, right? So I finally got income coming in the door and I have the ability to start paying off my debts, whether it's my student loans, if I got a credit card, a car, whatever it is. So naturally what you think is get the smallest one off the books, check that thing off and go to the next one, right? Because it's a feel good moment watching something go to zero. I've got a credit, I've got my student loans here. I want to get those off because then I feel like I've paid for college, right? And I'm completely out of it. But if you've got, say, a student loan and it's costing you maybe 7%, something like that, right? The interest rate. This is the most important part in my mind, is attacking the high interest rate debts, right? Because there are some good debts out there, right? Mortgages, that's a good debt. There's really nothing wrong with having a mortgage, in a general sense. Whereas having a credit card and having compounding credit card debt is considered bad, right? Because first of all, it's bad because it's like 20% plus that you're paying in interest.
Oh yeah.
That will eat you alive as compared to if you get a mortgage right now, you're probably looking at a 3%. It's a pretty solid interest rate. So the prioritization of debts to me is attack the high interest rate debts, because if you have something at $5,000 and it's costing you 3% or $20,000 at 20%, it's really daunting to pay down the 20 versus the 5. But by God, you're going to save a lot more money in interest payments, which you can't even write off with credit cards as compared to a mortgage. I think that just in a very simple way, just attack those debts that have the highest interest rate.
Yeah, love that. It's gonna build out your cash flow because most debts are considered non-discretionary assets or non-discretionary expenses, right? So the quicker you can get that off the balance sheet, the better, because that means that when it's gone, the income that was being used to pay that off can now go towards savings and investments.
One thing that I come across often, and I'm sure you do as well, Thomas, is people going back to this emergency fund and having money in the bank, right? People really like that feeling of security, of comfort of having money in the bank. But I'll come across someone with a considerable amount of money in either a brokerage account, a cash account in the bank, whatever it is, with conversely big credit card debt. Like say, for example, you got 20 grand in the bank, and your emergency fund ought to be 10 grand, right? So you got an extra 10 in there, and you've got credit card debt of $10,000. I've asked people, I'm like, hey, what do you think about paying off this debt? And it's like, well, I kind of like, just doing my monthly payments that I have to do, keeping it in house because I feel a lot more comfortable with it. I'm like, okay, well, what if I told you can guarantee, what if I told you there's an investment out there that can guarantee like a 15% rate of returns? I jump all over it. It's a no brainer, right? Yeah. Well, paying off that debt that's costing you about 15, 20% in interest, there you go, right? You pay that off and all of a sudden it's not generating this interest cost and you're saving that. And it's not how much you make, it's how much you keep. Right at the end of the day. So this is, an integral part of cash flow planning is just taking a look at your debts and saying, all right, let's wipe that one out or let's tack that one first.
Yeah. Yep. I love it. And then kind of on that, I feel like we've kind of breezed by it, but credit cards, credit cards and credit scores, we've talked about this, and I actually had a client situation like this last month, is understanding credit cards as much as you can, the ability to increase your limits. I think you want to be very careful with that. But also if you have the correct discipline and the correct strategy, increasing limits can be helpful. But kind of the credit score conversation, let me know a couple of your thoughts on the credit score conversation.
I think understanding how your credit score works is incredibly important. And just before I do, let me back up one piece here is that credit cards aren't a bad thing to have. I highly encourage, having at least one credit card because it will build your credit score. As long as you're disciplined, you don't get a credit card with a $10,000 limit and go, woohoo, let me go out shopping now. No, it's not, that's a red flag right there. Right. So it's good to have the ability to have it because, a financial advantage to it. If I go out to a bar or restaurant, I've got a card where I get 5% cash back. That's a benefit as long as I pay it off. Right. So, how that plays into your credit score. Credit score is incredibly important to understand, especially in, for whether you like it or not. It's a huge part of our financial system here in the U.S. Is your credit worthiness, right? Do you have a job? Do you have income? And are you good for paying off your debts? So, there's a lot of factors that go into credit scores, namely, how much you carry in debt on a percentage basis, right? So if you have a $10,000 limit, the magic rule, the number is don't go above, I think it's 30%, correct me if I'm wrong, but you don't want to go above 30% of your limit, meaning if you got a $10,000 limit, don't go above 3 grand. Even better than that, if you stay below 20 or 10, one of those two, you get a better credit score, right? Which the ultimate effect of that is if you go out and you have to finance a car, you can get a better, more friendly rate. It's incredible what having a good credit score will do for your financial well-being in the long run. And having a credit score, I can't tell you how many 40, 50-year-olds I come across who are credit ghosts, who've used cash their entire life, never had to build a credit score. And then all of a sudden you're starting the game in the 7th inning, right? You're starting to try and, improve your financial position at a way later spot in the game.
Yeah. Yeah. And you think about this too, this can kind of be a turn for some people who don't think credit scores are important, but are interested in the real estate game. Because here's the thing is you can't just set up an LLC and buy your first rental property, right? That first one you normally have to buy on your own because your LLC has no sort of credit worthiness or no sort of asset-backed security that they can provide as, collateral to buy a place, right? And,
Exactly.
if you're trying to get into real estate, you don't have to just equate the idea of, what's the down payment going to cost and what does, my monthly cash flow in a conversation, what does my monthly cash flow look like? You actually need to evaluate and make sure that your credit worthiness is good enough to apply as good a mortgage rate as possible, because the lower that rate, the better the income and the outflow is going to look like, right? And so just kind of evaluating that, having the best possible credit score that you can, because the better the score, almost always the lower the rate. The worse the score, almost always the higher the rate, right?
Yeah.
And so
you saw, yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but I mean, you saw it a lot in, recently with the low interest rate environment we're in. I mean, sure, you've been doing it a lot, encouraging clients to refinance their mortgage or something like that, getting a line of credit, a home equity line of credit, something like that. Your credit worthiness is a big part of that, right? I've had clients go in there, high net worth clients who just, for one reason or another, the credit score just wasn't where you would expect it to be. They go to refinance their house and they're getting rates clean higher than people who might not have as high of net worth, but they've got clean credit reports, a good credit score. Yeah. That is the difference between going out and getting a 2 5/8% on your mortgage versus 2 and 3, right? So it makes a huge difference over the long haul too.
Yep. Totally agree. I think and the refi piece, that can kind of play into cash flow as well.
Certainly can. Getting a home equity line of credit, that's another financial planning tool that you can use to increase the amount of credit you have and increase the amount of if you have an emergency fund can be replaced with a home equity line of credit. It's a totally different subject, but it's an interesting idea, a financial planning tool we use often. Yep. And you wouldn't be able to do it without a good credit score.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
One thing I'd like to change to, and it's one of my first introductions to financial planning was going up to my mom and saying, Mom, why don't you have a financial advisor? Because I don't want someone to tell me how to spend my money, honey. I was like, oh, boom, right off the jump, right? So that goes into what is cash flow in our minds? What is your income, expenses, what's left over at the end of the day? One thing I really try and emphasize to people is I'm not here to tell you how to spend your money, right? I'm here as a resource. I'm not here as the dictator. So one thing I always try is, I've helped out plenty of people with their budgets, but this is all supposed to be a guideline for someone to follow in order to set up the right habits and the right, to be consistent for themselves. I'm not going to go out and say, don't spend more than this on your car payment because you can't afford it, because everyone's different. And that's one piece here is that neither of us by any means are telling you how to spend your money. We're just trying to guide you into thinking about being the most efficient with it as possible.
Yeah. I think it reverts back to the plan, the get back to the plan conversation you had in the first episode, right? Is exactly. We're not telling you how to spend your money. We're saying, hey, these are your long-term goals. And in order to get there, this is what needs to be accomplished on a month-by-month basis, right? Now, it's up to you to say, hey, do I want to sacrifice the now and be more diligent so that I can get to where I want to be? Or am I going to kind of give into my current appetites and have that I don't want, somebody to tell me how to spend my money, attitude, right?
I've been in that situation where I've had a client who inherited a good sum of money and she wasn't in the best financial position. I could have recommended a few ways to spend it. Instead, she went out and got that brand new $40,000 truck. And, power to you if it makes you happy. And, at the end of the day, that's the important piece. But sometimes we may object, but, we're not the end all be all, answer for your decision. Yeah. Right. So that's just a little caveat I wanted to just throw
I think that's really good because I think that's there's some stigma there. Stigma on the industry that people think that from a planning perspective, we're going to tell you what your budget should be. Right. Yep. That's not how a good planner actually interacts and collaborates with households. Exactly. We're going to come to the table and say, hey, this is what your current situation looks like. This is where you want to be. In order to get there, we're going to need to just adjust a couple of these things. Now, ultimately, it's up to your duty to actually make those changes. But we're just essentially the non-attached, not emotionally attached advisor that's objectively saying, hey, if you want to get here, these are the changes that you'll want to consider making in order to get there. Right.
Absolutely.
And it's always fluid too.
It's I want to continue on my rant here. One thing too, it's just really important is understanding that piece, right? So let's kind of get back to where we were going here because my rant's over. So let's go back to the power of understanding interest payments and understanding what really is a debt payment, right? You look at someone, I've had a couple of clients who they bring their mortgage statements to me. They're like, Kyle, I don't really understand this. I just refinanced my mortgage. I just got a new house. I got a new mortgage, whatever it is. And my payments, I'm paying $1,000 a month. And it says this 600 is going to principal, 400 is going to interest. Why am I paying so much interest? Do you think you could give us a little insight on that, Thomas, about the one, what interest is, how it's front loaded, and two, the power of compounding interest if you don't adequately address it?
Yeah. And it's just kind of the idea, like you said, just breaking out what a mortgage payment is a portion is your principal, a portion is your interest. So the principal is essentially the beginning value of what your outstanding loan looks like, right? So interest is charged monthly against that principal. And so the very simple of it is the quicker that you can pay down the principal, the less the interest is going to continue to compound, right? And so it kind of outlines the idea of, hey, is it a good idea to pay extra down on my mortgage each month? And the answer to that is almost always yes, because what it's going to do is it's going to eat more away at that principal, therefore lowering the amount of interest that you're paying on a monthly basis. Because if you just take the traditional 30-year and you're just paying down on I kind of liken it almost to like a minimum payment on a credit card, right? Is if you're just making the minimum, you're just getting by, but that interest is continuing to compound. But if you're actually paying things off and you're maybe even making additional contributions, it's going to kill down that principal and it's going to kind of eradicate that interest payment quicker.
Yep. And if I could reinforce one thing too, because again, say you've got an extra $100 a month to throw at your debts. A lot of people I've come across, they want that mortgage off, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm kind of like paying economy, right? I'm putting an extra $300 toward my mortgage, but I'm doing my normal payment toward my credit cards because I want that mortgage off the books. It's a bigger debt, whatever it is, right?
Yeah.
You're putting the extra payment towards something that you're getting charged maybe 3 or 4% on. You got that extra payment, you're putting it 100% toward principal. Again, reemphasizing, put it toward that high interest rate, right? Yep. Get that $100 of principal off the 20% credit card, off the 8% student loan interest, right? So that's, it's always just taking a step back, looking at it and saying, where am I being the most efficient with my money?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, 100%. And even this is kind of an abstract piece, but one of the situations I've sometimes run kind of into when it comes to people that either inherit money or people that have a sizable savings account or even a sizable savings and brokerage account when they're looking at buying a new home, whether it's a primary or a secondary, and they're wanting to put a ton down on the house, right? Yep. From a cash flow perspective, you almost want to look in the opposite direction as debt prioritization, because one of the interesting things to talk about is, hey, if I can get a mortgage at 3% and I put just the normal 5, 10, 15, 20% down, kind of depending on what type of property, whether it's, secondary, personal, or if it's some sort of a rental property, that mortgage, the down payment will depend. But looking at if you were to actually just pay the monthly payments versus putting monies into an investment account, I think the conversation there is important too, because if you're paying 3% in annual interest on a mortgage, but you're applying the same amount of monies towards an investment account that maybe you can get, the running number on the S&P is 9% over a 15-year period, right? But you can get 9%, you've got essentially a 6% earnings potential right there, where sometimes having a conversation about that as well, I think is kind of interesting from a cash flow perspective.
Yep, there's no doubt about it. It's one of the easy ways to, you don't really think of it, but just taking a step back and really improving your long-term financial well-being.
Yeah,
it's just a really good approach to it.
Yeah,
and one other thing that as a financial advisor, anyone really can do it, but it's really interesting to run what's called an amortization table to be able to see the effect of it. You're able to build it in something like Excel, but this is something I do often. Even for my car payments, right? What happens if I put an extra $100 toward my car and you're able to just run that through? So I highly encourage, if you have any debts and you're wondering, and you're a numbers geek like us, and you want to go see what the value of doing your minimum payment versus $500 versus $1,000 a month, something like that, you're able to see that. And I think it's a really cool tool that anyone can use to figure out and understand the impact of paying down principal and putting extra towards your debts.
Yeah. I can't remember the number, and I should probably put a disclosure on this. I'm not 100% sure of the specific number, but when you look at a traditional 30-year, I think the last 4 full years of payments on a traditional 30-year mortgage are almost all interest.
What was that? The first 4?
No, the last 4.
Oh, yeah. Well,
I think
oh my gosh,
almost the last 3 to 4 years are almost always, and it could even be more. But just kind of understanding the idea of if you're just making the traditional payment on a mortgage on a 30-year loan, the back half of it is going to be primarily interest.
It'll make you sick. It'll make you sick looking at it, because it's like, oh yeah, $300,000 mortgage. You see it with student loans. Oh yeah, your $50,000 student loans. If you pay it off in this 10 years and totally pay $80,000, you're like, oh my god. Yeah. Like, oh, that might make you want to like prioritize putting some extra money toward it, right? Is understanding, seeing that extra money you put towards something is because of the interest.
Back to credit score too. The better your credit score, the lower the interest rate, the lower total amount of interest you'll pay on top of your loan. Because I think that's a piece too, is some people who aren't necessarily incredibly educated on the mortgage and even just the loan process, if they get a $200,000 mortgage, right? They think they're just paying $200,000 over a 30-year period.
Yeah.
At least maybe in the back of their mind, right? Yep. And they need to understand that 200 over a 30-year time frame is probably about 250, 260.
The first year, I mean, it's as easy as if you have a $200,000 mortgage at 3%. The first year of interest is $6,000.
Yeah.
Just right off the jump, right? That's just insane. It's just insane. So that's why, that's always be cognizant and prioritize paying off your bad debts. But that's the best way to get your balance sheet and your financial picture in order, is creating it's not, there's some debts out there that are good to have, but being able to prioritize paying them off. I mean, the old mentality, my parents would always say, don't buy something unless you can pay for it, right? All upfront cash. Now that's changed a little bit with how, low interest rates are and the way that we can get money lended to us easily. But it's a good mentality to have, to keep your house in order and not to take on too much debt, which could ultimately swallow you. I've also got clients who've had credit card debt for decades, and it's all they've ever known. And it's incredibly hard to claw out of it from there.
Yeah, 100%. We've covered a lot here.
I
think this is good. Episode 3.
Yep.
We're talking retirement planning. I'm super excited that one. I'm sure we could make 100 different episodes about retirement planning.
Oh my gosh, there's so many different topics. Yeah, it's gonna be a good one. Retirement planning is really, I think it's really interesting. And a caveat to everyone: retirement planning doesn't occur just in your 50s and 60s. You're doing it today.
Yep.
And it really starts with the cash flow and how you deploy it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and kind of looking at that, even just like a little bit of a teaser on that, is how can you effectively actually distribute retirement assets? Should I pull from my traditional IRA? Should I pull from my Roth? Should I pull from my brokerage? Should I be doing a mix of both? I think that's kind of where we're really going to hit on from a retirement planning perspective, because a lot of people have questions on that.
All about that flexibility.
Very situation dependent. And we'll definitely talk about that, but I'm super excited. I loved this episode. We might've gone a little heavy on the debt side, but it's so important, because that's where you can get down the slippery slope the quickest.
That's right.
So Kyle, thanks so much for your time.
Really always a pleasure, Thomas.
Yep. Appreciate everybody listening, and tune in next week. We're going to be talking retirement planning.
All right. See ya.
Thanks, guys.